greatest stories to me in the Bible. A story of love and a story of redemption. And of course, as we study it, we're going to look at parallels between Boaz and Jesus. Because what Boaz does for Naomi and for Ruth very much is in line with what Jesus did for us in his brief time on earth. And the parallels are amazing. But we'll get into that as we study. Not a very long book, 4 chapters. Probably maybe take us a couple of months at that to get through it, but still very worthy of study because of the lessons that we learn from the book of Ruth. Now we'll have a word of prayer, then we'll get into a little bit of an introduction into the book of Ruth. And Kevin Dixon, would you pray for us, please?
Holy Father, thank you for the privilege to be here this morning to study from your word. We pray, Father, that you would be with all the teachers and students in this lesson in a way that each student can understand and apply to their lives. We pray for those who are unable to be with us because of illnesses, that your healing hand will be upon each one, and be your will. Restore their health to them once again, and be with those, Father, who are grieving over the loss of loved ones, that you might touch them, Father, give them comfort and strength. Go with us through life and forgive us in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen. Now, a lot of times, writings in the Bible will not give us such an early clue, but the first verse of the book of Ruth tells us the time that it is describing, because it says right off the bat, now it came in the days when the judges governed. So now we know when this took place. So the book of Ruth connects the book of the Judges with the books of Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel. And again, this first verse tells us when it is placed, where it's located as far as the time of the Judges. And then the very last verse of the book of Ruth points us on to King David. And again, it is kind of a link to what we will go on and read in 1 Samuel. Now, an author is not mentioned for the book of Ruth. Now, in chapter 4, 17 to 22, there is a genealogy that takes us down to King David. And it is believed that this was written during the time of King David, which would be around the 1050 BC time. Now, according to the Babylonian Talmud of the Jews, Samuel the prophet may have been the author of the book of Ruth. We don't know for sure, but according to a lot of Bible scholars, things kind of point that way. That Samuel might have written this. Many Bible scholars share this viewpoint. So why was the book of Ruth written? Well, the book of Ruth describes God's love, God's grace. And despite the sin and the apostasy of the people of Israel, during the times of the judges, Jehovah fulfills a promise in regard to the coming Messiah. And of course, the genealogy that's in the end of Ruth continues that genealogy because David obviously is an ancestor of Jesus. His family, which Ruth is a part of, continues that genealogical line. So Ruth the Moabitess was not a Jew, obviously. As a heathen, she could not have any right amidst God's people according to the law. But she takes refuge with her Jewish mother-in-law, Naomi, and she lives among God's people. And as she is received into his people. And God's grace is extended to this Moabite lady. And by her marriage to Boaz, who is in a sense a redeemer of her, she receives a place in David's genealogy, and then also the genealogy of Jesus. Now, typically, this book will describe how God will receive the remnant of the people of Israel at the time of the end, which meaning Gentiles. Jews and Gentiles will all be accepted. Naomi typifies the people of Israel who've left their country and lost it all. This woman she lost her husband. She loses her sons. She is in a terrible state. All she has are her two daughters-in-law. So Ruth is a picture of the remnant of Israel in a sense that has no right whatsoever to God's promises, just as heathens had none at that time. But we know as we read through the story and we learn things here, that things change. And again, that is why this is almost a pattern for how Jesus, through his sacrifice on the cross, brings Jew and Gentile together into one group. Now, besides Ruth, Naomi, the main person of this book is Boaz, and he is considered, as we mentioned, a redeemer. And what's interesting, although this is the book of Ruth, Boaz's name is mentioned more than twice as much in the book as the namesake, Ruth. But the redeemer, such as Boaz, plays an important part in Israel, and it again is a precursor of Christ the Redeemer. The Redeemer had the tasks of redeeming the property of an impoverished Israelite, redeeming an impoverished brother, and executing judgment over a murderer. These are all facts that are found in the books of Leviticus and in Numbers, but here in Ruth we actually find a fourth task of a redeemer, the duty of an Israelite mentioned in Deuteronomy 25:5, to marry the widow of a deceased brother to maintain that brother's name. And it was apparently also applied to a remote relative. And it was not just a remote relative, but it was a non-Jewish relative. Maybe you've heard the Yiddish term goy. Heard that? Goy means non-Jew. That's what while you'll sometimes hear a Jewish mother talk about her goy son-in-law. And you know, it might sound like a little hateful or a little weird, but it's actually a term of endearment. In this sense, Ruth or Naomi was a goy, or the actual Hebrew term is goel. Goel. And although she's not Jewish, Boaz redeems this widow who was married to his brother. Now, later Judaism, this custom of marrying another for this reason went away. Didn't take place quite as much. Now, there's a lot of names with a lot of interesting meanings in the book of Ruth. We see Elimelech, who was the husband of Naomi, and his name means, my God is king. We will read of a man named Mahlon, and his name means sickness. Chilion is consumption. Mahlon and Chilion were the sons of Naomi and Elimelech. Now, Boaz, his name means in him is strength. The name Naomi means my pleasantness. Mara, a name, it is a name that means bitterness. Don't name your child Mara. Orpah, her neck. And finally, the name Ruth means beauty or satisfied. So there's great meaning in these names, great meaning in what we're going to follow as we look into the book of Ruth. So again, written probably during the time of King David, but based back in the times of the judges. And of course, we studied the judges about a year ago and learned much about them. But this is a beautiful story, and it is one that is so applicable today. It is something that we can read and we can understand, and we can receive great strength and great satisfaction from what we read. So let's bear into it here. So chapter 1, we'll look at the first couple of verses here. Now it came about in the days when the judges governed that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the land of Moab with his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem in Judah. Now they entered the land of Moab and remained there. And I know that Jeff would be disappointed if we didn't know where Moab was located. Right? It was east of the Dead Sea. Southeast corner. And of course, it was east and way south of where Bethlehem and Jerusalem would have been. So this was actually quite a significant journey for Elimelech and his family to go there from Bethlehem to the land of Moab. So again, these things happened during the time of the judges, before there was a king ruling Israel's people. So again, Moab, opposite side, east side of the Dead Sea. I believe, if I remember reading the map correctly, if we looked at the tribal apportionments, I believe Ephraim was a little bit north of where Moab was located. So where the tribe of Ephraim had its land over on the east side of the Jordan River. Reuben, that's what it was. Had the wrong one. It's Reuben. But so the Reubenites, so part of Israel was literally right next to Moab, north of Moab, and right, exactly. So we know these things through our Wednesday night study recently, so we get an idea. Of course, again, they come from Bethlehem. At that point, Bethlehem was a significant town. It was considered at that time a large town, and it produced a lot of food. It was a market town. Of course, we know that there were sheep around it. There was a lot of cattle. There was a lot of farming that was going on. But what happens? What's described here? There's a famine. All of a sudden, it's hard to find food. It's hard to feed a family. And Elimelech wants security for his family, for Mahlon, Chilion, and for Naomi. So they leave their home in Bethlehem to look for food elsewhere.
By the way, Ephrath is the former name of Bethlehem.
Ephrath, that's right.
Ephrathites.
That's it, Ephrath, yeah. So they run into, they go around the Dead Sea, and they end up in Moab for no doubt a Jehovah worshiping family like Elimelech's. This was a problem. Why? Idols. Moabites were idol worshipers, did not worship Jehovah. As Jeff mentioned, Elimelech was an Ephrathite. And probably what that meant was that he belonged to one of the chief families of Bethlehem. And as Jeff mentioned, Ephrath was the old name for Bethlehem. It's actually mentioned in Micah 5:2, if you want to look that up. So Elimelech takes his wife Naomi and his 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, and they plan to stay in Moab for only a short time. They thought, until we can ascertain that the famine is over in our homeland, we'll go here where we can eat, where we can live. Again, Elimelech means my God is king. Naomi means pleasant. But what had happened in Naomi's life certainly did not match in her name. These weren't pleasant things, to uproot yourself, your family, and move many miles away and move into a new land. That wouldn't be comfortable for us. It certainly wasn't comfortable for them. Now in Ruth 1,
Something bad, Bill, because during the Great Depression, people did that in Detroit. So
they did.
they were starving to death here.
They were moving to many Midwestern industrial cities. You're exactly right. That happened in this region a lot. That's right. Now we'll study a little later in Ruth 1:20. Naomi realized that there was much unpleasantness in her life, and she was in one of these situations that we see throughout this book where there is a lot of woe expressed. There's a lot of pain that is expressed, and it occurs in Ruth 1:20, and we'll get more into it. Now, of course, we mentioned that Mahlon and Chilian's names were ones that were not very pleasant, and it seems to be that their names kind of foresaw the fact that they were maybe sickly and weak, because we know, as we're going to continue to study, that they have a sad ending. They have an early ending to their lives, and sad events are to come. And the sad events pick up right off the bat here in verse 3. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died. They're in Moab. And she was left with her two sons. So Mahlon and Chilion and Elimelech, and Naomi are alone. Elimelech dies. We don't know his age. We don't know why he died. Of course, we know that he probably wasn't starving if they had moved to Moab to find food and found adequate food supply. So maybe he had some kind of a other malady that they had to deal with. But desperate situation here for Naomi. She has two sons to provide for. They don't have the things we have today that would help take care of youngsters in a family that has been, that the provider has been taken away. And this is a desperate situation for Naomi. So let's continue with the story here in verses 4 and 5. And it says that they took for themselves Moabite women, the native women. They took Moabite women as wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. And they lived there about 10 years, about a decade. Then both Mahlon and Chilion also died. Still relatively young men, no doubt. And the woman was bereft of her two children and her husband. So as we said, the two sons away from Bethlehem, they marry a couple of the local girls, the Moabite women. And Orpah and Ruth obviously attracted these two young men, these two young Jewish men. But they were also, no doubt, very much in the way of the local idol worship. Now, the name of the Moabite god was Chemosh. And Chemosh is actually written quite a bit in the Old Testament. I want to look up a scripture here. 2 Kings 23:13 talks a little bit about this Moabite god Chemosh. 23:13. And it reads, the high places which were before Jerusalem, which were on the right of the Mount of Destruction, which Solomon, the king of the Israel, had built for Ashtoreth, the abomination of the Sidonians, and for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and from Milcom the abomination of the sons of Ammon, the king defiled. What does that tell us? Solomon, in his bad state, later in his life, had built a Chemosh altar, image. What does the Bible say? They weren't images, they were abominations, because they were in direct challenge to Jehovah. And it was so sad that Israel went down that path, especially under the leadership of supposedly a wise man like Solomon. Now we know the reasons why he kind of swerved off the road. We know that there was political convenience that took place in some of these things as far as marriages and the implementation and importation of these idols. So there's a marriage of 10 years. And after a decade, these girls, Orpah and Ruth, become widows, just as their mother-in-law, Naomi. And apparently, they had no sons. After 10 years, no children came out of either one of these marriages. And now Naomi was without any man from her family to look after her, because her sons were gone too. And again, she's in a foreign country. She's not among her own people. And some hard decisions must be made. And she does that. Verses 6 and 7. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law, that she might return for the land of Moab, for she had heard of the land of Moab that the Lord had visited his people in giving them food. There was food back in Bethlehem. So she departed from the place where she was, and her two daughters-in-law with her, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. So Naomi hears good news here in verse 6. The famine's over. I can go home. I can go to a place that God has provided sustenance to. I can leave this land that doesn't recognize Jehovah. Problem is, I don't have a man to help with me. My sons are gone. My husband's gone. All I've got are these two girls, Orpah and Ruth. And so it says here that in verse 7 that they join her in going back to Israel, to the land of Judah. So they're going to take advantage, or take good advantage, that is, of God's blessing for his people. Ruth, or Naomi that is, trusted that God looked after his people. She was very much a lover of Jehovah and a believer in Jehovah. And she had the faith that I can go home and my needs will be met. And you can tell that after all these years, she was a little homesick too. She just wasn't like these Moabite people. And it had been a tough coexistence for Naomi. She wanted to go home. And her daughters-in-law, Moabite though they are, may have been more comfortable staying among their people. But they go with her because they love their mother-in-law. We know that it's an old wives' tale about mothers-in-laws and stuff, but not in this case. Orpah and Ruth love Naomi, and they follow Naomi wherever she goes. And that means, in this case, going back to Judah, going back to among the people of Judah, to the city of Bethlehem. Great love shown there. verses 6 and 7. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law that she might, right, verses 8 and 9, I got behind here. Verses 8 and 9. Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you dealt with the dead and with me. May the Lord grant that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices, and they wept. So what's Naomi doing here? She's giving Orpah and Ruth an out. She's saying, although we love each other, I'm not going to obligate you to go with me. Because just as I've been in a strange land, if you go with me, you're going to be in a strange land among strange people. And the overriding thing is Orpah and Ruth are still relatively young. They're still very much of marrying and childbearing age. And they could marry again. And their people, their families, will look after them. There was no guarantee that Naomi would be able to look after them in necessarily a bountiful manner. It might be a struggle. No guarantees for Orpah and for Ruth. Naomi was grateful for their kindness. Again, loved these daughters-in-law. She blesses them. But she also trusted God too. She felt that whatever their decision, good would come of it. She believed in God's grace, God's providence working for these young ladies, that their lives would be good no matter the decision they make. And she speaks about Jehovah here. She ends this, the end of verse 8, start of verse 9. She invokes the name of Jehovah. She says, may the Lord, she means Jehovah, deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. May the Lord grant that you may find rest each in the house of her husband. So that shows how important Jehovah was to Naomi. She passes that along to her daughters-in-law, and she prayed to God to look after Ruth and after Orpah. So she's saying you have a decision to make. You have a choice to make.
You know, like you said, Paul, see the promise of God working through the genealogies all down.
Oh, yeah.
But she still actually God to bless two foreign women, two Moabite women who had been idolaters.
Right.
So we don't know how much they changed during their marriage to the sons. But they're still Moabite women.
It does seem to indicate that the love of Naomi had been a big influence on these young ladies, that's for sure. Well, let's go on. We'll start with verse 10. We'll actually go through verse 14 here.
Good question, Bill.
Okay.
In verse 6, talking about visiting this people by giving them bread. What is she referring to there?
Well, that would indicate that the famine was over. That's an old term. Visiting means basically that God had blessed them, given them favor. Yeah. All right. So that's the blessing being extended by Jehovah to again to His people, and which is interesting because of all the great things that were promised to His people as long as the covenant was maintained. We've studied it, we've discussed it, that there were times that natural factors would come into play. And of course, God controls all. Of course, a lot of the things that happened to the children of Israel were brought on upon themselves because of their own disobedience, their blatant sin, and one wonders maybe this famine was a product of that. But still, they go through a rough time, and maybe it refocused their dedication to Jehovah, and Jehovah relents from this famine. So let's go on, and we'll look at verses 10 through 14. So this option has been given to Orpah and to Ruth and Naomi. You're young, you have opportunities. Why don't you think about going home to your people rather than following me on a hard journey back to my people, Bethlehem? But we see here in these verses the great love that Ruth and Orpah had for Naomi, and the deep dedication that they had for their mother-in-law. And it begins, and they said to her, to Naomi, "No, but we will surely return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return, my daughters. Why should you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may be your husbands?" There's not any men here. "Return, my daughters. Go, for I'm too old to have a husband. If I said I have hope, if I should even have a husband tonight, and also bear sons, would you therefore wait until they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is harder for me than for you." She's saying, my prospects are gone. You two have life. You have youth. And you have a future. I don't have a future. Naomi's telling Ruth and Orpah, "It's harder for me than for you, for the hand of the Lord has gone forth against me. I've lost my sons. I've lost my husband. I'm advanced age. The opportunities are gone for me that are there for you, you young ladies."
That reminds me of Job.
Yeah.
Blaming themselves for something they've done. And the Lord's not, God's done whatever.
Right. Yeah, that is interesting how this quote is that Naomi is wondering, have I done something to anger God, that I am left without sons and left without a husband, and I still have life, although I'm much older, and I've been in Moab for over a decade, and I have these daughters-in-law here, and I'm giving them opportunity, or giving them this option of staying with me or going. You know, all these things happen to me because the hand of the Lord, as it says here, has gone forth against me. And in verse 14, it says, "And they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her." So, right at the start of this, Ruth and Orpah say, "We want to stay with you, Naomi." Again, Naomi is a kind-hearted, good woman. And she wants what's best for these daughters-in-law. And she says, "I can't give you new husbands. I'm beyond the childbearing years. It's not like you can sit around for all these years and wait for this new husband that I might provide you, because I can't. I don't have a man myself." And she's basically telling Orpah and Ruth, you need to find you a man and marry for a secure life. You need to have a good future. You need to ensure a good future for yourself. You need security. So Naomi tries to persuade them to go back to Moab, go back to their families, reestablish their lives, and show the fact that they are very much at this point available for marriage. And we see here in verse 14, although it made her sad, this message got through to one of the girls. Because, as verse 14 tells us, Orpah kisses her mother-in-law. But unlike Ruth, who clings to Naomi, Orpah's not clinging to her. kissing her goodbye. Orpah takes that option. She's going to go back to her family, but not Ruth. We're going to get more into that in the upcoming verses. Let's look at verses 15 through 18. That probably will get us through the rest of our study this morning. So Naomi begins here at verse 15, and she says, "Then she said, Behold, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people, and her gods, Chemosh and whoever else, return after your sister-in-law. But Ruth said, Do not urge me to leave you or turn back from following you, for where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God." Don't those words sound familiar, wedding attendees? Right? Song, wedding song, quite common, uses those words. They're beautiful. Verse 17, "Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus may the Lord do to me, and worse, if anything but death parts you and me." When she saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more to her. That is Naomi. Naomi was quite silenced by what Ruth says here. It is quite blunt what she says here. So Ruth understood what Naomi was trying to get across to her. But her love for her mother-in-law superseded any personal ambition where I can stay in Moab and get a husband. I can get a family here in Moab. I can just stay home. I don't have to go anywhere else. But no, that's not what she says, because she loves Naomi dearly. And she even basically is setting aside this wisdom. And it was wisdom that was coming from the mouth of this Jewish woman, Naomi. This was pearls of wisdom for both her daughters-in-law. Again, Orpah took the advice, not Naomi, because she loved her mother-in-law. And you see maybe that the example of Naomi was getting to Ruth. Her dedication to Jehovah, her love of Jehovah, her blessing of them in the name of God, Jehovah God, had made an impression. And that impressed Ruth. She appreciated the strength and the sentiment. And she makes her mind up that whatever Naomi follows, I'm going to follow. And that seems to mean at this point Jehovah. And she would be loyal to Jehovah and to Naomi. And she was ready to give everything else up. And she says, where you go, I'll go. Where you stay, I'll stay. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. We're not separated. And Ruth chose to belong to Naomi's people and to worship Jehovah. And now the book kind of turns from being Naomi's story. Now it's Ruth's story. And we'll pick it up next Lord's Day, verse 19.